Before cities and empires, we were wanderers on this pale blue dot. Our journey began in flickering firelight, painting stories on cave walls. As tools evolved from stone to bronze, so did we. Now, gaze upon the wonders of ancient civilizations. Pyramids, ziggurats, great walls. This is humanity's greatest journey, written in the stars and etched in stone. In the great timeline of our species, for more than 95% of human history, we roamed. Across grasslands, forests, rivers and deserts, we lived as gatherers and hunters, intimately bound to nature's rhythms, dependent on the land but never rooted to it. And then something changed. Something so profound it would rewrite the destiny of our species. This is the story of how humanity stopped chasing food and made the earth feed us instead. Welcome to the dawn of farming. Roughly 12,000 years ago, in a region stretching from modern-day Israel and Palestine through Syria, Iraq and into Iran, something remarkable began to unfold. Here, in what we now call the Fertile Crescent, wild grains like emmer wheat and barley grew in abundance. At first glance, they looked no different from the grasses that blanketed the plains, but these plants held a secret: calories, protein, sustenance, and crucially, seeds. For tens of thousands of years, our ancestors had gathered these grains by hand. But sometime around 10,000 BCE, in the soil of this crescent-shaped corridor, the relationship between humans and plants shifted. No longer were we simply foragers. We were about to become farmers. Why here? Why then? The end of the last ice age had brought a warmer, wetter climate. Glaciers receded, rains returned, and the land became lush. More plants, more animals, more people. But abundance brings competition. With population densities rising in certain regions, food security became a question not of the chase, but of control. And so the first experiments began, gathering seeds and deliberately planting them. At first it may have seemed like a gamble, a waiting game. But when it worked, it changed everything. At sites like Jericho and Ain Ghazal, archaeologists have uncovered ancient tools used to harvest and grind grain. These weren't just the tools of survival. They were the instruments of a revolution, the agricultural revolution. But with great change came great cost. Farming was hard, backbreaking. It demanded regular hours, constant maintenance, and it tied people to the land. The freedom of the forager gave way to the routine of the cultivator. Over generations, early farmers began to notice not all plants were equal. Some grains grew taller, some yielded more, some were easier to harvest. Unknowingly, humans were conducting a genetic experiment, domesticating plants not by laboratories, but by instinct and selection. Alongside the crops, communities grew. From scattered family bands came clusters of homes, villages, anchored to the rhythms of sowing and harvest. No longer did people wander. They settled, built homes, birthed children who would never know the nomad's life. This was more than agriculture. It was the beginning of civilization. The transition from foraging to farming didn't happen overnight. It took generations, centuries even, and it unfolded in many places: China, Mesoamerica, the Sahel, each with its own crops, its own challenges, its own path. But it began here, in the soil of the Fertile Crescent, where hands met earth, and where humanity first asked, what if we could make the land stay? In planting the seed, we planted ourselves. And from that act, all the wonders and all the burdens of civilization would follow. The world would never be the same again. In the beginning, there was movement. For countless generations, our ancestors wandered, following herds, tracing rivers, never staying long. But then came stillness. The moment we planted seeds into the ground, we planted something else, the roots of permanence. This is the story of how we built homes, forged communities, and turned the fire into a hearth. The transition from foraging to farming was not just about food, it was about settlement. As early agriculturalists began to grow crops in fixed plots, the nomadic rhythm of life gave way to something entirely new, the village. Simple, yet revolutionary. The first homes were not grand. They were modest structures shaped from mud, straw and timber. But they were more than shelter. They were memory keepers. Spaces where children were born, where meals were shared, where the day began and ended. Villages like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey give us a glimpse. Over 9,000 years ago, people built rectangular houses, huddled close together like puzzle pieces, entered not through doors, but from rooftops. They lived with their dead, often burying family members beneath the very floors they slept on. Life and death, layered in clay. At the center of every home burned the hearth, more than warmth, more than light. It was the heartbeat of domestic life, a place for cooking, story-sharing, ritual. It bound generations together, each fire kindled from the last. The hearth defined the home and, by extension, began to define civilization. As farming produced surplus, storing food became essential. Clay jars, woven baskets, sunken pits lined with stones. With storage came security and inequality. Some families stored more than others, some shared, others hoarded, and so began the earliest murmurs of social hierarchy. Villages allowed for something humanity had never truly known, specialization. When not everyone had to hunt or gather, some people became potters, toolmakers, herders, healers. The economy of the village wasn't measured in coins, but in skills. For the first time, trade emerged, not across continents, but across yards. A polished stone blade in exchange for a basket of grain. A clay figurine swapped for fresh goat milk. Barter, reputation, trust, the foundations of commerce, long before markets had names. Contrary to what we might expect, early villages were not fortresses. They had no walls, no gates, no moats. They were cooperative, not combative. Archaeological layers show few signs of warfare. Instead, what emerges is a picture of shared labor and collective living. But peace came with a price. Living in close quarters brought new challenges: disease, sanitation, contagion. Where once a fever burned out alone in the forest, now it could sweep through entire households. The comforts of community came with unseen dangers. The village was not purely human. Animals joined us: goats, sheep, dogs, the first to cross the boundary from wild to tame. In return for food and shelter, they gave milk, wool, protection. The line between human and animal spaces blurred. They lived with us, beside us, sometimes even beneath us. It was messy, it was smelly, but it was the start of something profound: domesticated companionship. With permanence came pattern. Footpaths became streets, gathering spots became squares, homes turned into neighborhoods, and slowly something intangible began to form identity. A child wasn't just of this family, they were from this village, from this place. Names had meaning, places had memory, people had roots. The story of the village is not one of grandeur. It is not empires or kings. It is the story of ordinary people, of mothers and fathers, of children and elders, of friends and strangers, becoming neighbors. From these humble hearths, humanity learned to live together, not just side by side, but in shared story. We learned to stay, to build, to belong. The age of the wanderer was fading, and in its place, the age of the builder had begun. For most of our time on Earth, humans survived at the mercy of nature. We followed the herds. We gathered what was ripe. We hunted what moved. But slowly, quietly, the balance began to shift. We no longer chased life. We began to shape it. This is the story of how humanity took its boldest step, taming the wild. It began with a seed. In the Fertile Crescent, long before irrigation or empire, early farmers noticed something curious. Some grains were easier to harvest. Some stalks held their seeds longer. Some grew stronger, taller, fuller. They saved those seeds, planted them, harvested again. Unknowingly, they were performing an experiment in selective breeding, and nature responded. Within a few hundred generations, wild wheat was transformed. It no longer scattered its seeds freely. It waited for human hands. Domesticated wheat could not survive without us. Just as we were learning, we could not survive without it. It wasn't just plants we changed. Some of our oldest companions walk on four legs. Dogs, first drawn to our camps by scraps and warmth, slowly became part of the tribe. The bond grew, protection for food, loyalty for shelter. Then came goats and sheep, and later cattle and pigs. Imagine, if you will, a time-lapse of goat taming from wild mountain herds to fenced pasture. Early herders learned which animals tolerated human presence. They figured out which ones reproduced in captivity and which offered milk, meat, wool, and didn't bite too hard. Through trial and error, patience and persistence, humanity carved a new role, not just predator, but partner. Domestication didn't stop at selection, it demanded innovation. Fences to contain, ropes to lead, troughs to feed, pens to breed. In inventing agriculture, we also invented infrastructure. And the more we shaped nature, the more it shaped us. Domestication wasn't a single event. It happened all over the world independently. In China, wild grasses became rice. In the Americas, teosinte became maize. In Africa, sorghum. In New Guinea, bananas. Each region found its own solution to the question, how do we feed ourselves tomorrow? What united them all was intention. The moment we stopped taking from nature and began negotiating with it. Domestication leaves a mark, not just on behavior, but on biology. Domesticated animals became smaller, rounder and calmer, less aggressive, more fertile. Plants too, bigger fruits, sweeter pulp, brighter colours, more yield, less defence. In short, they became useful and utterly dependent. Domestication was not without sacrifice. Wild species lost their independence. They became property, commodities, stock. But so did we. In exchange for security, we gave up freedom. We became tied to seasons, to cycles, to fences of our own making. But from this tethering grew civilization. Taming animals and plants required something new, planning, a sense of time, of investment, of patience. You don't plant a seed for today, you plant it for 6 months from now. In domesticating the wild, we began to domesticate ourselves. From grasslands to granaries, from hunting grounds to homesteads. We didn't just tame nature, we entered a pact with it, a pact written not in ink, but in fur and fire and soil. And through it we would grow not just crops, but kingdom. In the story of early civilization, the plough and the hearth are often seen as symbols of progress, but just beneath the surface lay something else. Hidden in the furrows of the first fields, in the spaces between grain jars and rooftops, a new force was germinating: inequality. This is the story of how the very seeds that fed us began to divide us. In a world of wandering tribes, ownership meant little. But in settled villages with permanent homes and harvests to protect, the idea of mine began to take hold. A patch of land, a clay jar of surplus, a goat, a tool, a wall. These were no longer shared by all, they were claimed. And with that claim it came a new concept: property. Not all fields yielded equally. Not all families had the same strength, timing or luck. And slowly, for the first time in human history, some began to have more than others. The earliest farmers learned quickly. Survival required work, constant, repetitive, specialized work. As food production increased, so too did the division of labor. Men often took to the fields and flocks. Women managed the hearth, the children, the grains, and in time, what began as practical difference hardened into social expectation. Roles became rules. Agriculture didn't just shape our diet, it structured our time. Each season demanded a different task. Each task demanded different bodies, and not all were treated the same. In forager societies, gender roles were more fluid. Everyone contributed to the hunt, the gather, the tribe, but with agriculture came domestic confinement. Women's roles became centered on the home, the children, the kitchen, while men took public leadership, ownership and control. This wasn't universal, nor was it immediate, but over generations it grew quietly, systemically, like weeds among the wheat. With surplus came exchange, with exchange came value. What was once gathered and shared now became traded and priced. Clay jars became units of worth. Goats were wealth on legs. Land became status. For the first time, some families could live from the labor of others. A hierarchy took root not by strength or wisdom, but by accumulation. Villages grew into stratified societies. Elites controlled food, controlled land, controlled people. From this foundation, classes would one day form, and with them, castes, nobility, serfdom and slavery. Inequality, once born, needed stories to survive, and so early religion and proto-governments began to intertwine. Leaders claimed divine favor. Temples collected grain taxes in the name of the gods. Sacrifice and submission were taught as sacred. The line between spiritual power and economic control blurred, and many believed it was meant to be so. Even writing itself in places like Mesopotamia was born not from poetry, but from accounting. The first words we etched into clay were numbers, inventories, ledgers, records of debt. Not only had inequality arrived, it now had receipts. As families passed land and goods to their children, wealth became heritable. Born into a family with more meant a head start. Born into less meant staying behind. A child's fate was no longer tied to ability or effort, but to what their parents had planted. In just a few thousand years, the human world had transformed. We had conquered hunger, built homes, domesticated animals, stored grain. But in doing so, we had also planted something else, a growing chasm between the few who controlled and the many who labored. And once sown, inequality would be hard to uproot. From humble hearths to hoarded harvests, from fields of hope to ledgers of loss. The agricultural revolution gave us much, but it also gave us a choice, to build together or to divide. And the echoes of that choice still shape our world today. In the quiet before dawn, before the plough touches the earth, there is a whisper, a murmur to the wind, a nod to the sky, a hand pressed into the soil with reverence. For as long as we have sown seeds, we have sought meaning. And from that search, something extraordinary emerged. Religion, ritual, rule. This is the story of how belief began to shape society, and how the sacred gave rise to the state. The first farmers depended on forces they could not control. The sun, the rain, the rhythms of growth and decay. To survive, they needed more than tools. They needed trust in something greater. They began to see the divine in nature, in rivers, in mountains, in thunder and fire. And they built the first temples not from ambition, but from awe. At sites like Göbekli Tepe, dating back over 11,000 years, we find the fingerprints of the sacred. Vast stone circles, elaborate carvings, no signs of domestic life, only ceremony. Before the first village came the first sanctuary. With crops came cycles, planting and harvest, drought and flood, and with cycles came uncertainty. Rituals offered comfort. They gave rhythm to the unknown, drumming, chanting, dancing. These were more than performance. They were prayers in motion. Many rituals centered on fertility of the earth, of livestock, of the womb. The act of blessing a seed before planting it was a quiet cry for abundance. Over time, some individuals took on roles as interpreters of the divine. They became the keepers of ceremony, the mediators between earth and sky. They did not plant or herd, but presided over those who did. And in doing so, they grew powerful. The first priesthoods were born. Offerings, once symbolic, became tangible. Grain, oil, livestock, cloth. The gods needed feeding, and their servants kept the storehouses. Temples became banks, and those who controlled them controlled more than just faith. As villages grew, leaders needed more than strength. They needed legitimacy, and nothing legitimized power like the favor of the gods. Rulers began to cloak themselves in divinity. They were chosen, blessed, descended from the heavens, or so the stories said. Myth became mandate. Laws were handed down from above, even if written by men. Religion was not just spiritual, it was scientific. Priests observed the stars, tracked the seasons, predicted floods. Their knowledge shaped calendars, and calendars shaped planting, taxation, war. The temple became a center of data long before the term existed. To know when the Nile would rise, to know when to store grain or hold festival, was to control time itself, and time is power. From sacred shrines grew sacred cities, from ritual records grew ledgers and taxes. The temple evolved into an administrative machine, managing goods, issuing orders, keeping accounts, and thus the state was born. In time, temples merged with palaces, priests with kings, ritual with rule. Power was now both divine and absolute. Not all belief was blind, not all ritual was willing, but for many, the cost of doubt was high, and the promise of order too seductive to resist. Religion gave meaning, it gave hope, but it also gave rulers the tools to command. The divine voice became a voice of authority, and not all who listened heard the same promise. We built altars from stone, but the gods we placed on them came from within. In seeking meaning in the soil and sky, we found faith. And in that faith, we found power. What began as worship would become the architecture of civilization.